The wind was a sculptor of this land, and its medium was dust. For 3 days, it had howled from the west, a relentless, raw-throated beast, stripping the moisture from the air and scouring the hard-baked earth until the horizon itself seemed to fray. It was a wind that made a man feel small, and a lone woman feel like a ghost already, under the oppressive weight of a sun the color of bleached bone. Ellen dragged herself forward, each step a negotiation with exhaustion. The hem of her gray wool dress, once respectable, was now a tattered fringe caked with the mud of a long-gone creek bed. Her shoes, thin and worn through at the soles, were a mockery of protection against the unforgiving terrain of the Texas prairie. Before her, shimmering in the heat, was a fence line. It was not a grand fence, merely weathered posts and taut wire, but it represented a border between the absolute desolation behind her and the faintest glimmer of possibility ahead. Beyond it stood a solitary homestead, a sturdy, unadorned cabin of hewn logs, a large barn, and a corral, all huddled together as if for comfort against the sheer, crushing emptiness of the plains. This was it. This was the place the man in the last sorry excuse for a town had pointed her toward. Caleb, he'd said, spitting tobacco juice. Keeps to himself. Lost his wife some years back. Might need a hand, if he's in a mood to speak to folks at all. Hope was a dangerous thing, a flickering candle flame in this gale, but it was all Ellen had left. She pushed open the simple gate, its creak swallowed by the wind, and walked the final 100 yards to the cabin. The closer she got, the more the place seemed to take on the character of its owner. It was stark, functional, and utterly without adornment. There were no flowers by the door, no rocking chair on the porch, no sign of life save for a thin curl of smoke from the stone chimney. A man emerged from the barn as if summoned by her silent approach. He was tall, built with the dense, unyielding strength of an old oak. His shoulders were broad, his hands large and calloused. A dark beard, neatly trimmed but thick, covered the lower half of his face, and his eyes, the color of a winter sky, were narrowed against the sun and her presence. He wore simple denim breeches and a flannel shirt, sleeves rolled to his elbows, revealing forearms corded with muscle. This was Caleb. He stood there, holding a harness, making no move to welcome her, his stillness a wall she had to breach. Ellen stopped a respectable distance from the porch steps, her throat a knot of dust and fear. "Mister," she began, her voice a dry rasp she barely recognized. "Mister, I'm looking for work." Caleb's gaze swept over her, a clinical, dismissive assessment. He saw the tattered dress, the grime on her face, the way her hands trembled at her sides. He saw another drifter, another piece of flotsam washed up on his shore. "Ain't got any," he said. The words were flat, final. Panic clawed at her. "Please," she whispered, the word nearly stolen by the wind. "I can cook, I can clean, I can muck out stalls, mend fences, tend a garden, anything. I'm a hard worker. I don't need much, just a place to sleep. Some food." She hated the pleading in her voice, the way it stripped the last of her dignity. But dignity was a luxury she could no longer afford. Survival was a baser instinct. He shook his head, his expression unchanging. "This ain't a charity. Got no use for a hired girl?" He turned as if to go back into the barn, the conversation over. He had built this solitary life precisely to avoid this kind of complication, this kind of messy, needy humanity. 3 years ago, he had buried his wife, Martha, and with her, he had buried the part of himself that knew how to connect, to care, to risk. The silence and the hard labor of the ranch were his penance and his shield. "Please," Ellen said again, a little louder, taking a weak step forward. Her vision was starting to swim, the edges of the world blurring into a gray haze. The last piece of hardtack she'd eaten felt like a lifetime ago. The world tilted, the tall man rippling like a reflection in water. Caleb heard the shift in her tone, the fraying of her last thread of strength. He turned back, a flicker of irritation in his eyes, and saw her sway. He saw her eyes, wide and a startling shade of green even in her grimy face, lose their focus. He saw her knees buckle. He moved without thinking. In 2 long strides, he crossed the space between them just as she crumpled, catching her before she hit the unforgiving ground. He was shocked by how light she was, a bundle of rags and bone. Her head lolled against his shoulder, and a faint, ragged breath escaped her lips. She was unconscious. For a long moment, Caleb stood frozen, the strange, warm weight of this woman in his arms, a profound and unwelcome shock to his system. He should leave her on the porch. He should fetch a dipper of water and send her on her way the moment she came to. It was the sensible thing to do, the safe thing. But he looked down at her face, pale beneath the dirt, her dark lashes stark against her skin. A strand of auburn hair had escaped her bun and lay plastered to her temple with sweat. He saw not a nuisance, but a profound and desperate weariness, with a low curse aimed at the sky, at his own weakness, at the memory of a different woman he had failed to save. He tightened his grip and carried her inside his home. The cabin was one large room, dominated by a massive stone fireplace on the far wall. The air within was cool and smelled of wood smoke and old leather. It was a man's space, meticulously clean but ascetic. A sturdy table with 2 chairs stood in the center. A bed, neatly made with a simple wool blanket, occupied one corner. A dry sink, a cast-iron stove, and shelves holding a few plates and tins of food lined another wall. There were no curtains on the windows, no rugs on the polished floorboards, no photographs on the mantel. It was a shelter, not a home, a place to wait out the storms, both outside and in. He laid her gently on his bed, the incongruity of her ragged form on his clean blanket striking him. For a moment, he just looked at her, a strange turmoil brewing in his chest. He was a man who had intentionally emptied his life of softness, and now it had been thrust back upon him in the form of this unconscious waif. He fetched a damp cloth and, with an awkwardness born of long disuse, gently wiped the grime from her face. As the layers of dust and travel were washed away, he saw her more clearly. She was younger than he'd first thought, perhaps only 20 or 21. Her features were fine, delicate even, with a high brow and a determined chin. Even in the deep exhaustion that held her captive, there was a quiet purity to her face, a hint of a beauty that life had done its best to extinguish. The sight stirred something in him, a confusing mix of pity and a deeper, more unsettling feeling he refused to name. It felt like a betrayal. It felt dangerous. When she finally stirred, the sun was casting long, orange shadows across the floor. Her eyes fluttered open, disoriented, and then widened in alarm as she found herself in a strange bed, in a strange house. She sat up abruptly, her head spinning. Caleb was sitting at the table, watching her. He pushed a bowl of thin stew and a mug of water toward her side of the table. "Eat," he said, his voice still gruff, but lacking the hard edge of dismissal it had held before. Ellen looked from the food to his impassive face, her mind racing. She remembered the wind, his refusal, the world going dark. She realized with a jolt of shame that he had carried her in. She swung her legs over the side of the bed, her bare feet touching the cool, smooth wood of the floor. She wouldn't stay where she wasn't wanted. "Thank you for your kindness, Mr.—" she said, her voice steadier now. "I'll be on my way." "It's dark," he stated, a simple fact. "The wind's picking up. Coyotes will be out." He gestured to the bowl again. "Eat. You can sleep in the barn, in the hayloft. It's warm enough." It wasn't an invitation, but a command. It was a temporary truce with his own nature. He was offering shelter, not welcome, a bed of hay, not a place in his home. The distinction was important. He was helping, but he was keeping her at arm's length, out in the barn where she belonged, separate from the ghosts that inhabited his house. Ellen looked at him, truly looked at him, and saw the deep conflict in his eyes. She saw the compassion warring with a profound, guarded pain. She nodded slowly, too weak and too grateful to argue. She sat at the table, keeping her back straight, and ate the stew. It was the most delicious thing she had ever tasted. She didn't speak, and neither did he. The only sounds were the scrape of her spoon against the bowl and the lonely shriek of the wind as it clawed at the corners of the log cabin, a sound that echoed the desolation in both their hearts. When she was finished, he led her to the barn. The air inside was thick with the sweet, dusty smell of hay and the warmth of the animals in their stalls. He pointed to a ladder leading up to the loft. "There are blankets up there," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Don't use a lantern. Fire hazard." He turned to leave her there in the shadows. "Mister?" Her voice, small but clear, stopped him at the door. He paused, his back still to her. "Thank you," she said. He didn't answer. He simply pulled the heavy barn door closed, plunging her into near total darkness, the slivers of moonlight through the slats offering the only light. She climbed the ladder to the loft and found the pile of clean, rough wool blankets. She burrowed into the hay, pulling the blankets over her, and for the first time in weeks, she felt something akin to safety. She looked toward the house, a single square of yellow light in the vast, oppressive dark. In her eyes, there was the deep, hollowed-out look of the desperate, but in the set of her jaw, there was the unyielding iron of determination. Back in the cabin, Caleb stood by the window, staring out at the dark shape of his barn. He was wrestling with himself. The act of carrying her, of feeding her, had breached a wall he had spent 3 years building. He could still feel the phantom weight of her in his arms, see the unguarded purity of her face as she slept. He was a man drowning in the memory of one woman, and now the tide had brought another to his door. He felt a profound sense of dread, a fear of the thaw, for a man who had made a home in the frozen landscape of his own grief. The first crack in the ice was the most terrifying thing of all. The pre-dawn air was cold enough to steal the breath, sharp and clean in a way that scoured the lungs, long before the first hint of gray lightened the eastern horizon. Ellen was awake. Sleep had been a shallow, restless thing, but the hay had been warm and the darkness a shield. She didn't pause to consider her aches or the lingering weakness in her limbs. Survival was a relentless master, and it demanded payment in sweat. She slipped down the ladder from the loft, her movements silent and practiced. The barn was still steeped in night, filled with the soft sounds of sleeping animals, the gentle snuffle of a horse, the rustle of a cow shifting in its stall, by feel and memory. She found the milk pail and a 3-legged stool, the ranch's lone milk cow, a placid Jersey, barely stirred as Ellen sat beside her and began to work. Her hands, though chapped and sore, were sure. The rhythmic pull and hiss of milk into the pail was a familiar, comforting sound, a piece of a life she had once known, before it had all been burned away. When the pail was full and frothing, she carried it to the small spring house built over a cold creek that ran behind the cabin, setting the milk in the cool water to keep. Then, she returned to the barn, took a pitchfork, and began to muck out the stalls. The work was hard and mindless, and she welcomed it. It was honest, it was real. It was a way to build a wall against the memories that haunted the quiet moments. Caleb rose with the sun, as he had every day for years. His routine was a bulwark against thought, a series of tasks that filled the hours and left him too tired to feel. He pulled on his boots, stoked the embers in the fireplace, and went to the door to face the day. He stopped dead on the threshold. A neat stack of freshly split kindling and firewood sat beside the cabin door. A thin, steady plume of smoke was already rising from the chimney of the small outdoor stove he used for cooking in the warmer months. And through the open barn door, he could see her, the woman, her back to him, methodically pitching soiled hay into a wheelbarrow, her movements efficient and strong despite her slender frame. He stood there for a long time, a silent, unmoving observer. He had expected to find her gone, or at best, still asleep in the hay. He had not expected this. He watched as she finished the stalls, led the horses to the trough, and refilled their feed. She did not rush, but there was no wasted motion in her. There was a quiet, profound dignity in the way she worked, a pride in the simple completion of a task. It was the same way he worked. In her, he recognized the language of labor, the unspoken creed of those who wrested a living from this unforgiving land. It stirred a reluctant flicker of respect in his chest, a feeling he quickly tried to smother. Respect was a step toward connection, and connection was a door he had nailed shut. When she finally emerged from the barn, wiping her hands on her worn dress, she saw him standing there. She froze for a second, a cornered animal's instinct, her eyes wide. She feared his anger, his dismissal. "I made coffee," was all he said, his voice a low growl. He jerked his head toward the outdoor stove and went back inside the cabin. Ellen's shoulders sagged in relief. It wasn't praise, but it wasn't a command to leave either. She found a tin mug and poured the steaming black liquid, her hands trembling slightly as she lifted it to her lips. It was bitter and strong, and it felt like a reprieve. Their days settled into a strange, silent rhythm. She would rise before him, tending to the animals and the morning chores. He would emerge and they would work the ranch, often on separate tasks, but always within sight of each other. They rarely spoke. Words were an extravagance neither of them seemed to have much use for, but a language of gestures began to form. He would leave a bucket of water near the small patch of earth she had started to till for a garden. She would leave a plate of cold biscuits and jerky for him when he was mending a fence line far from the cabin. It was a communication born of shared space and mutual observation, a fragile web being spun in the vast silence. He found himself watching her more and more. He saw the way the wind caught the auburn strands of her hair, the deep concentration in her eyes as she mended a tear in his shirt, the quiet grace in her tired posture at the end of a long day. He was a man who had sworn off beauty, and yet he found it in these small, stolen glances. About a week into this silent arrangement, a wagon rattled up the path. Caleb looked up from the harness he was repairing, his face hardening. It was Jedediah, his nearest neighbor, a man whose property was a good 2 miles east but who considered that just down the road. Jedediah was an old man, his face a roadmap of wrinkles, his eyes sharp and curious. "Caleb," the old man called out, reining in his mule, his eyes immediately fixed on Ellen, who was hanging laundry on a line she had strung between 2 posts. "See you've got yourself some help." "Jedediah," Caleb acknowledged, his tone flat. The old man spat a stream of tobacco. "Saw her from the ridge yesterday. Figured I'd come see you hadn't been bushwhacked in your sleep." He squinted at Ellen again. "Where'd you find this one?" "She was looking for work," Caleb said, his voice clipped, offering no further explanation. Jedediah cackled, a dry, rustling sound. "Work, she says. Be careful, son. A drifter woman ain't nothing but a magnet for trouble. The folks in town, they get to talking. A man living alone, taking in a strange female. They got ugly names for that kind of thing." He leaned closer, his voice dropping. "You remember what they said about Martha after, well, you know. Folks got long memories and short imaginations." A muscle jumped in Caleb's jaw. He did remember. He remembered the whispers, the sideways glances, the suspicion that had clung to him like a shroud after his wife's death. "I can handle my own affairs, Jedediah." "Just saying," the old man shrugged, picking up his reins. "A pretty face can hide a dark past. You watch yourself," with a final, lingering look at Ellen. He clicked his tongue and the wagon groaned back down the path. The old man's words hung in the air, thick and poisonous. That evening, as the sun bled across the horizon, painting the sky in violent shades of orange and purple, Caleb found Ellen by the corral, staring out at the endless prairie. "Where you from?" he asked, the question abrupt, stripped of any preamble. She flinched, her gaze snapping back to him. "A town east of here, called Redemption." She said the name with a bitter irony that did not escape him. "What happened there?" Ellen wrapped her arms around herself, a gesture of self-protection. For a long moment, she said nothing. The only sound, the rising cry of the wind. The prairie was a harsh confessional, its vastness both intimidating and liberating. "I was married," she began, her voice low and devoid of emotion, "to a man named Silas. He had a heavy hand and a mean temper when the whiskey was in him." Caleb said nothing, his face an unreadable mask, but he listened. He liked to gamble, liked losing more than winning. It seemed we were always in debt. The town, the people, they looked down on us. On me. A gambler's wife is no better than the gambler himself. In their eyes. She paused, taking a shaky breath. "He died, about 2 months ago." "How?" The word was like a stone dropping into a well. The story spilled out of her then, a torrent of memory she had held back for too long. There was a storm, a terrible one, rain coming down in sheets. He'd been in town, drinking, gambling away the last of our money. He came home in a rage. He was shouting, saying it was my fault, that my sad face brought him bad luck. Her voice cracked, but she pushed on, her eyes fixed on the darkening horizon. "He came at me. I ran for the stairs, to the attic, to lock myself in. He grabbed the back of my dress. The fabric tore. He was drunk, unsteady. He lost his footing." She stopped. The silence that followed was immense, filled with the image she had just painted. "He fell," she whispered, "all the way down the stairs. There was a terrible sound, and then it was quiet. The rain was the only thing I could hear." She looked at Caleb then, her green eyes shimmering with unshed tears. But her gaze was direct, unflinching. "The sheriff came. He called it an accident, but the town, they whispered. They said I'd pushed him. They said I was glad he was dead. They saw the bruises he'd left on me over the years and called them a motive. The coldness of the ostracism, the shunning, was as palpable in her voice as the memory of her husband's fists. She had been tried and convicted in the court of public opinion. Caleb looked at her, at the raw, unvarnished truth in her eyes. He had seen liars in his time. He had seen the guilty. They blustered or pleaded. They didn't speak with the hollowed-out emptiness of someone who was simply stating a fact of her own miserable existence. He believed her, and that simple, unbidden belief scared him more than anything Jedediah had said. The days that followed were harder. A dust storm blew in, a roiling wall of brown that turned midday into twilight and forced them to shelter the animals, their faces covered with bandanas, their eyes stinging. At night, the wolves sounded closer than ever, their lonely, predatory howls a stark reminder of the wildness that was always waiting just beyond the lamplight. The land grew drier, the creek shrinking, the earth cracking like old pottery. It was a world of harsh edges and constant struggle. One night, the cold returned with a vengeance, a sudden snap that promised an early frost. Caleb was sitting by his fire, unable to sleep, the ghosts of his own past circling in the shadows. He heard a sound from the direction of the barn, a sound almost imperceptible under the wind. It was the choked, desperate sound of a woman crying in the dark. He knew it was Ellen. He pictured her alone in the hayloft, wrapped in thin blankets, wrestling with the demons he now knew by name. Every instinct for self-preservation screamed at him to ignore it, to add another log to his own fire and forget he had heard anything. To ask about her tears would be to invite her pain into his house. into his life. But he couldn't. He stood, his jaw tight, and took the heavy wool blanket from the foot of his bed. It was the one Martha had woven, thick and warm. He walked out into the biting wind, the cold a welcome shock. He didn't go into the barn. He didn't call her name. He simply folded the blanket and placed it on the ground, just inside the barn door where she would be sure to find it in the morning. Then he retreated to the solitude of his cabin. The next morning, before the sun was up, Ellen descended the ladder. Her eyes were red-rimmed and swollen. As her feet touched the ground, she saw it, a dark, folded square of wool, lying just inside the door. It wasn't one of the rough blankets from the loft. This one was softer, heavier. She picked it up. It smelled faintly of wood smoke and clean linen, the scent of his house. She knew, instantly. He had heard her. He had not come to her, had not offered clumsy words of pity that would have only shamed her. He had offered this, a silent gesture of warmth against the cold. She clutched the heavy blanket to her chest, her knuckles white, and sank to her knees. A single, hot tear traced a path through the dust on her cheek. It was not a tear of sorrow. It was a tear of agonizing, heartbreaking gratitude. For a kindness so small and so unexpected it felt larger than the sky itself. The seasons on the prairie did not arrive gently. They seized the land. Autumn collapsed into winter overnight, heralded by a wind that carried the sharp teeth of the north. One evening, a hard frost fell, encrusting the world in a brittle layer of silver. Caleb, standing on his porch, watched his breath plume in the frigid air and saw the thick ice that had formed in the water trough. He looked toward the barn, a dark shape against a sea of stars, and thought of Ellen sleeping in the hayloft. Hay was warm, but it was no defense against a cold that sank into a person's bones. The next morning, he found her breaking the ice in the trough with a hammer, her hands red and raw, her shoulders hunched against the biting air. He had spent the night wrestling with the thought, and now, seeing her, the decision was made. He would not allow it. "Gather your things," he said, his voice flat, making it sound like an order. Ellen looked up, her face a mask of confusion and fear. Her first thought was that he was sending her away. The blanket, the quiet meals, it had all been temporary. Her heart plummeted. "Mr. Caleb!" "You're moving into the house," he continued, ignoring her expression. "There's a room in the back. It was for storage. I've cleared it out. The cold set in. No sense in you freezing to death in a barn." Relief washed over her, so potent it almost made her dizzy, but it was immediately followed by a familiar, coiling anxiety. "I can't," she said, shaking her head. "Thank you, but I can't. Jedediah was right. People will talk." Her past was a testament to the destructive power of whispers. A woman living under a man's roof, unmarried. It was a story that wrote itself in the minds of others, and it never had a happy ending. Caleb's expression hardened, not with anger at her, but at the ghosts she was afraid of. He took a step closer, forcing her to meet his gaze. "Listen to me," he said, his voice low and intense. "Listen." He gestured to the vast, empty expanse that surrounded them. The rolling brown hills meeting a pale, endless sky. Who is there to talk? There's the wind. There are the coyotes. There ain't nobody else to hear but the wind, and the wind don't gossip. His logic was as stark and irrefutable as the landscape itself. They were an island, and for now, the rest of the world was a distant, irrelevant ocean. She looked at his steady, serious eyes and felt her own fear begin to recede, replaced by a fragile sense of security she hadn't felt in years. She gave a single, slow nod. The back room was small, containing only a narrow cot, a small table with a wash basin, and a single window that looked out onto the rising sun. It was more than she could have dreamed of. That evening, for the first time, she did not retreat to the barn after their work was done. Caleb motioned for her to sit at the table inside the main room. He served stew onto 2 plates, and they ate in their customary silence. But something had changed. The silence was no longer a void between them, but a space they shared. It was comfortable, filled with the crackle of the fire in the hearth and the low moan of the winter wind outside. It was the quiet of 2 solitary people who were, slowly, learning not to be alone. As the days grew shorter and colder, Caleb decided she needed to learn to ride properly. "A woman on a ranch who can't sit a horse is half useless," he'd stated, his practical excuse for what was, in truth, a desire to share a part of his world with her. He chose his calmest mare, a gentle buckskin named Daisy, and led her into the corral. His instructions were sparse, communicated more through gestures than words. He showed her how to hold the reins, how to shift her weight, how to press her knees to guide the animal. He was a patient teacher, his large, rough hands adjusting her grip, his presence steady and reassuring. Ellen, in turn, was a determined student. She was clumsy at first, but she was fearless, her resolve hardening each time she found her balance. One afternoon, a jackrabbit darted across the corral, and Daisy, for all her placid nature, shied sideways with a sudden snort. The unexpected movement was too much for Ellen. She cried out, her hands flying from the reins as she lost her seat. She was falling. Caleb moved with a speed that belied his size. He was there before she hit the ground, his arms closing around her waist, breaking her fall and pulling her tight against his chest. The impact sent a jolt through both of them. Her hands landed on his shoulders, her face buried for a second in the rough wool of his shirt. He held her fast, his grip like iron, making sure she was steady. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice a low rumble against her ear. She tilted her head back to answer, and the world stopped. Her face was inches from his. She could see the deep blue of his eyes, flecked with gray like a stormy sea. She could feel the warmth of his breath on her lips, smell the scent of leather and sawdust and clean winter air that clung to him. Her own breath caught in her throat. His gaze dropped to her mouth, and for a heartbeat. The air crackled with a tension that had nothing to do with the fall. The silence of the prairie pressed in, amplifying the frantic thudding of her own heart. He leaned in a fraction of an inch, his eyes dark with an emotion she had never seen there before. Then, as quickly as it had happened, it was over. Caleb seemed to catch himself, his expression shuddering. He abruptly loosened his grip and stepped back, leaving her standing unsteadily on her own feet. A dark flush crept up his neck. He wouldn't meet her eyes. "Lesson's over for today," he muttered, turning to grab Daisy's reins. He was rougher with the horse than necessary, his movements jerky and angry. He led the mare away without another word, leaving Ellen standing alone in the middle of the corral, her lips tingling with the ghost of a kiss that had never happened. That night, neither of them slept. In his bed, Caleb stared at the ceiling, his hands clenched into fists. He was a fool. For 3 years, he had lived by a simple code: work, eat, sleep. No complications, no feelings. The memory of Martha was a sacred, painful thing he kept locked away, and he had almost betrayed it for a moment of weakness. The woman in the next room was a threat to his carefully constructed peace, a warmth that threatened to melt the ice he had encased his heart in. He was furious with himself, and more than that, he was afraid. In her small room, Ellen lay awake, her body humming with a strange, new energy. She touched her fingers to her lips, the memory of his closeness vivid and unsettling. She had forgotten what it felt like to be looked at with desire, to be held by a man whose touch was not meant to harm. The feeling was terrifying, but beneath the fear was a flicker of something else, something she had thought long dead, a hopeful, fluttering warmth. The fragile peace was shattered 2 weeks later. They were running low on flour and salt, and Caleb, grim-faced, announced he had to ride to the small settlement that passed for a town, a day's ride away. Ellen, desperate for a change of scenery and a chance to procure some thread, asked if she could accompany him. He agreed with a reluctant grunt. The town was little more than a dusty street with a general store, a saloon, and a blacksmith. As they tied their horses to the hitching post, Ellen felt the familiar prickle of eyes on her back. Women stopped their conversations to stare from behind curtains. Men on the boardwalk paused, their gazes lingering on her with a mixture of curiosity and contempt. It was redemption all over again. While Caleb was negotiating with the blacksmith, Ellen slipped into the general store. As she was paying for her thread, a group of children, no older than 10, gathered by the doorway, their faces smudged with dirt. They began to chant in a sing-song voice, loud enough for everyone in the store to hear. "Caleb's got a sweetheart. Caleb's got a sweetheart. The pretty widow in his bed. Soon she'll wish that she was dead." The shopkeeper's wife flushed and refused to meet Ellen's eyes. A cold dread washed over Ellen, so intense it made her nauseous. The children's cruel rhyme was a reflection of the adults' ugly whispers. She fled the store, her purchase forgotten, her heart hammering against her ribs. She couldn't do this again. She couldn't be the source of another man's ruin. She wouldn't drag Caleb down into the mire of gossip and suspicion that had swallowed her life before. She was packing her few meager belongings into a bundle when Caleb found her in her room that evening. "What are you doing?" he demanded, his voice sharp. "I'm leaving," she said, not looking at him, her voice trembling. "I heard the children in town. I heard what they're saying. I won't do that to you. I won't be your shame." "Shame," he growled, stepping forward and grabbing her arm, forcing her to face him. His touch was not harsh, but it was unyielding. "You think I give a damn what a bunch of gossiping fools and their bratty children think?" "It doesn't matter what you think," she cried, tears finally breaking free and streaming down her face. "It matters what they do. They'll make your life a misery. They'll drive you out. It's what they do, I know." He saw the sheer terror in her eyes, the deep, scarring trauma of her past, and in that moment, his own fear, his own hesitation, was burned away by a fierce, protective anger. He was not going to let her run. He was not going to let them win. He tightened his grip on her hand, his thumb stroking the back of it, a gesture of surprising gentleness. "Stay," he said, his voice dropping, imbued with a conviction that shook her to the core. He looked directly into her eyes, and for the first time, he did not hide what he was feeling. "Stay, Ellen, I need you. This ranch needs you." It was not a declaration of love, but it was something more real, more powerful. It was an admission of dependence, a plea from a man who had never admitted to needing anyone. The word "I" hung in the air between them, a confession more intimate than a kiss. She stopped struggling, the fight draining out of her, and simply stood there, his hand a warm anchor in the storm of her fear. That night, the first winter fever took him. He awoke near midnight, shaking with chills, his skin burning. Ellen, drawn by the sound of his restless tossing, came into his room. She found him delirious, muttering his dead wife's name. Without a moment's hesitation, she took charge. She built up the fire until it roared, and spent the rest of the night bathing his forehead with cool cloths, forcing sips of water between his cracked lips. Toward dawn, the fever broke. He woke to find himself clear-headed, weak and drenched in sweat. Ellen was asleep in the chair beside his bed, her head slumped at an awkward angle, a damp rag still clutched in her hand. He lay there, watching the gentle rise and fall of her chest, a profound, aching tenderness filling him. Later, after he had taken some broth, they sat together by the hearth. The storm, both inside and out, had passed. He was weak, and she was tired, but a new quiet had settled between them. She reached out to feel his forehead, her touch gentle and clinical. He caught her hand, not letting her pull away. Their eyes met, and this time, Neither of them looked away. The gaze held, long past the point of polite comfort, becoming a silent conversation. In it, he saw her strength, her compassion, and in his eyes, she saw not pity, but a deep, burgeoning respect and a warmth that finally, truly, reached all the way to his soul. They had faced down the ghosts of the past and the judgments of the present, and for the first time, they had done it together. The first snow fell not with the fury of a blizzard, but as a quiet surrender. Fat, silent flakes drifted from a sky the color of slate, blanketing the hard, brown earth in a layer of pristine white. It muffled the world, softening its harsh edges and lending a hushed, reverent peace to the landscape. But inside the cabin, a different kind of cold was taking hold. Caleb was trapped in a dream. He was standing by the lone oak tree on the rise behind the barn, the place where Martha was buried. But the grave was open, the earth dark and raw against the green summer grass. She was there, not as he remembered her in the end, but as she was when they were first married, her hair the color of corn silk, her eyes full of life. But her face was etched with a sorrow that cut him to the bone. "You've forgotten me, Caleb," she whispered, her voice not angry, but filled with a deep, bottomless disappointment. "You've let another woman into our home. You've let her sit in my chair. You're forgetting—" He tried to speak, to tell her it wasn't true, that her memory was a stone he carried in his chest every single day, but no sound would come out. He could only watch as she faded, her form dissolving into the mist rising from the fields, her whisper echoing in the hollow chambers of his heart. He woke with a jolt, his body slick with a cold sweat despite the chill in the room. The cabin was dark, the only light a faint, gray luminescence from the snow-covered window. He looked at his hands, then around the room, and the dream's accusation settled over him like a shroud. He felt a wave of profound, suffocating guilt. He had been letting the ice around his heart thaw. He had been letting himself feel something other than grief, and it felt like a betrayal. Ellen sensed the change the moment he emerged from his room. The nascent warmth that had begun to grow between them was gone, replaced by the old, familiar frost. His eyes were cold again, his gaze sliding past her as if she were a piece of furniture. His words were clipped, functional. "Stove needs wood," was all he said before pulling on his coat and disappearing into the white world outside. She watched him go, a knot of unease tightening in her stomach. She knew this kind of withdrawal. She had seen it in men before, a storm brewing beneath a silent surface. But this was different. This wasn't anger directed at her. It was something deeper, a wall he was rebuilding brick by painstaking brick. She didn't ask what was wrong. The prairie had taught her that some struggles were meant to be weathered in silence. So she simply carried on with her chores, giving him the space he so clearly craved, the quiet cabin crackling with an unspoken tension. The distance between them stretched through the next week. The snow kept falling, piling into deep drifts that isolated them even further. The silence in the house grew heavier, a stark contrast to the howling of the wind outside. The world intruded in the form of Jedediah, who appeared one afternoon on horseback, his face grim. He refused to come inside, speaking to Caleb from the saddle while Ellen watched from the window. "It's bad, Caleb," the old man said, his breath fogging in the air. "The talk in town ain't just whispers anymore. A few of the men from the saloon, the O'Driscoll brothers and their lot, they've been drinking and talking loud, talking about cleansing, about a man living in sin needs a lesson. They were talking about fire." A cold fury, sharp and clear, sliced through Caleb's guilt-ridden haze. It was one thing for fools to gossip. It was another to threaten his home, his land, to threaten her. "Let them come," Caleb said, his voice dangerously low. "This ain't a game, son," Jedediah warned. "They're stupid and they're drunk, and that's a dangerous combination. You watch your back." That night, Caleb was a coiled spring. He cleaned his shotgun, his movements precise and deadly. He checked the locks on the doors, his eyes constantly scanning the white darkness outside the windows. Ellen watched him, her own fear a cold stone in her gut. But her fear was not for the O'Driscolls. It was for him. She saw the self-destructive fury in his eyes, the look of a man who had nothing left to lose and was ready to burn the world down. The next day, against the advice of both Ellen and Jedediah, he rode for town. "We need supplies," was his excuse, but they both knew he was riding toward a confrontation. Ellen spent the day in a state of agonizing suspense. Every gust of wind sounded like hoofbeats. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. He returned just after dusk, his horse lathered, his face a grim mask. He didn't have to tell her what had happened. She could see it in the bruised knuckles on his right hand and the dark, simmering rage in his eyes. He'd found the O'Driscoll brothers in the saloon, as he knew he would. He had walked straight up to their table, the room falling silent around him. He hadn't shouted. He had spoken in a low, terrifying voice, telling them that if he so much as saw their shadow near his property, he would consider it a threat, and he would eliminate it. A chair was thrown, a punch was landed, and the saloon keeper had pulled out a shotgun to stop a brawl from turning into a bloodbath. Ellen met him at the door as he stomped the snow from his boots. "You didn't have to do that," she said, her voice trembling. "You could have been hurt, or worse." "They needed to be told," he growled, pushing past her toward the fire. She followed him, grabbing his arm. "For what? For me? To defend my honor?" Her voice rose, laced with a desperation he didn't understand. "Caleb, you can't fight the whole world for me." She sank to her knees before him, clutching his hand, her face streaked with tears. "Please, don't throw your life away. Don't get yourself killed over ugly words and stupid men." Her plea broke something in him, the cold control he had maintained for years. For a week, for a day, finally shattered. He wrenched his arm from her grasp and slammed his fist against the stone mantel of the fireplace. A raw, guttural roar of pure anguish tearing from his throat. He whirled on her, his eyes blazing with a pain so profound it stole her breath. "I've lost one woman," he bellowed, the words echoing in the rafters, raw and ragged. "I buried her. I am not going to stand by and lose you too." The confession hung in the air, a shocking, brutal admission of his deepest fear. He wasn't just protecting her from them. He was protecting himself from the agony of another loss. Ellen stared up at him, her tears stopping. The sheer, naked pain in his voice cut through her own fear. She rose slowly to her feet, her expression transformed from pleading to a deep, resonant strength. "I am not her," she said, her voice quiet but firm, each word landing with deliberate force. "I am not Martha." She took a step closer, her gaze unwavering. "Caleb, I don't need you to protect me. I need you to trust me. Trust *us**. His anger seemed to drain away, leaving him looking hollowed out and lost. He stared at her as if seeing her for the first time, not as a drifter, not as a reminder of his loss, but as the woman standing before him, strong and unbroken. As if on cue, the wind outside, which had been moaning all evening, rose to a terrifying shriek. A blast of snow hit the cabin with the force of a physical blow, and the world outside the windows dissolved into a churning, white chaos. The blizzard had arrived. For the next hour, they worked in a frantic, silent truce, battling the storm. They reinforced the barn door, dragged extra firewood inside, and secured the shutters. The temperature plummeted, and the wind howled like a banshee, a sound of pure, elemental fury. "The mare," Caleb shouted over the roar. "She's due to foal soon. And the new calf. They won't survive the night in the main barn. The cold will kill them." He was right. The only place warm and sheltered enough was the small, tight stable attached to the side of the main barn, where they kept the milk cow. They fought their way through the blinding snow, the force of the wind threatening to tear them from their feet. Inside the relative quiet of the stable, the air was thick with the warm, earthy smell of animals and hay. They led the pregnant mare and the young calf inside, settling them in a deep bed of clean straw. The storm was a living thing now, a monster trying to tear their world apart. The stable shuddered under the force of the wind. There was no question of returning to the house. They were trapped. They huddled together in the darkness, the only light a single lantern casting long, dancing shadows. The only sounds were the howling of the wind, the soft chewing of the cow, and the sound of their own breathing. The argument, the dream, the town, it all fell away, stripped down to the bare, essential reality of survival. Cold, dark, storm. Ellen began to shiver, a deep, uncontrollable tremor. Caleb, without a word, pulled a heavy horse blanket from a hook and wrapped it around her shoulders. He sat down beside her in the hay, his back against the wooden wall. He hesitated for only a second. Then he put his arm around her, pulling her against his side. His body was a wall of solid warmth against the biting cold. She leaned into him, her head finding the natural hollow of his shoulder. He could feel her shivering slowly subside as his heat seeped into her. They sat in silence for a long time, listening to the symphony of the storm. It was a terrifying, yet strangely intimate, moment. The world had been reduced to this small, warm space, to the two of them and the beasts that breathed softly in the dark. She shifted, tilting her head to look up at him. His face was all angles and shadows in the lantern light, his expression unreadable, but his arm was tight around her, a silent anchor. He looked down at her, and his eyes were no longer cold. They were dark and deep, filled with the raw, unspoken emotions of the night. This was not about romance. It was about something far more primal. It was about the instinct for life in the face of a storm that promised death. It was about two lonely, wounded souls finding a flicker of warmth in an endless, freezing night. He lowered his head, slowly, deliberately, giving her every chance to turn away. She did not. She rose to meet him, her cold fingers finding their way to his jaw. Their lips met, tentative at first, then with a deepening, desperate hunger. It was not a gentle kiss. It was a kiss of survival, a desperate affirmation of life against the howling chaos outside. He laid her back in the sweet-smelling hay, the blanket pooling around them. There were no words. Words were useless things, artifacts of a world that no longer existed. There was only the language of touch, of need, of the frantic, beautiful, human desire to connect, to hold on, to simply be, together, as the blizzard raged on. The world was born anew in the aftermath of the blizzard. A profound, ringing silence had replaced the storm's fury, and the sun, when it finally broke through the clouds, cast a brilliant, almost painful light on the landscape. The prairie was a vast, unbroken sea of white, every flaw and hardship of the land buried under a blanket of pure, crystalline snow. Inside the cabin, the silence was of a different kind. It was heavy, charged with the memory of the night before, when they had finally struggled back from the stable at dawn. Numb with cold and exhaustion, they had moved around each other with a careful, deliberate distance. The raw, desperate intimacy of the stable felt like a dream, something too volatile to be examined in the harsh light of day. A line had been crossed, a seal had been broken, but neither of them knew how to speak of it. Ellen made coffee and fried bacon, her movements small and contained. Caleb split firewood with a controlled, rhythmic violence, as if trying to work the memory out of his muscles. When they sat at the table to eat, they did not look at each other. The air was thick with unspoken questions. What had happened? What did it mean? What were they now? The quiet that had once been comfortable had become a chasm of uncertainty. He had held her, and she had held him back, and now the ghost of that connection sat between them. A third presence at the small wooden table. For 2 days, they lived in this fragile truce with the morning, the unspoken thing pulsing between them. They worked, as they always had, digging out paths, tending to the animals. their shared labor the only language they could still safely speak. The mare, thankfully, had weathered the storm, and her time was near, a promise of new life that felt both hopeful and terrifyingly fragile. On the third day, the sun had done its work, and the trail to town was a passable track of slush and mud. Their supplies were critically low after being snowed in. "I need to go to town," Caleb announced, his gaze fixed on the far wall. "For flour and grain for the horses." "I'll come," Ellen said, her voice quiet but firm. She would not hide. She would not let the town, or their own awkwardness, make her a prisoner. He simply nodded, and they rode out together, the silence stretching between them like the long, muddy miles. The town, when they reached it, seemed to be suffering from a collective fever. The blizzard had cooped people up, letting resentments and rumors fester. As Ellen dismounted, she felt the stairs like a physical touch, sharp and hostile. The O'Driscoll brothers stood on the saloon porch, their expressions sullen and menacing. But it was the women who were worse. Their gazes were filled with a brittle piety, their mouths thin lines of judgment. Caleb went to the feed store, leaving Ellen to go to the mercantile for the flour and other household goods. She took a deep breath, squared her shoulders, and walked inside. Her head held high. The store was crowded, and a wall of cold shoulders met her. Conversation stopped. People turned away. She paid them no mind, gathering her items and placing them on the counter. As the shopkeeper was weighing the flour, an old woman with a face like a dried apple and eyes like black beads pushed her way to the front. It was Mrs. Gable, the preacher's wife. "Harlot," the old woman hissed, her voice loud enough to carry through the silent store. "You come into our town, a decent, God-fearing place, and you lead a good man into sin. You are a plague." Ellen's face went pale, but she did not flinch. "You don't know me, ma'am," she said, her voice low and steady. "I know your kind." Mrs. Gable spat. Before anyone could react, she stooped, her hand closing around a sharp-edged rock from the muddy street that had been tracked inside. With surprising speed, she threw it. The rock struck Ellen on the temple. She cried out, more in shock than in pain, stumbling back against a barrel. A dark line of red bloomed on her skin, welling up and trickling down her cheek. The store erupted in a chaos of gasps and murmurs. At that exact moment, Caleb walked in. He took in the scene in an instant. Ellen, pale and bleeding, her hand to her head, the horrified faces of the townsfolk, and old Mrs. Gable, standing with a look of righteous fury. A darkness crossed Caleb's face that was more terrifying than any saloon brawl. He moved past the onlookers as if they were ghosts, his focus entirely on Ellen. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice a low, controlled rumble that was somehow more menacing than a shout. He gently took her hand away from the wound, his touch infinitely tender as he examined the cut. He turned his head, and his cold, furious gaze swept the room, finally landing on Mrs. Gable. "Who did this?" he demanded. The old woman drew herself up. "She is an abomination, and the Lord's work must be—" Caleb took a single step toward her, and the preacher's wife, for all her righteousness, shrank back, her words dying in her throat. He looked as if he could snap her in two, but then he looked back at Ellen, at the blood on her face, and a different instinct took over. Vengeance could wait. She needed care. "We're going to see the doctor," he said, his voice soft now, meant only for her. He put a protective arm around her shoulders and led her from the store, the crowd parting before them like the Red Sea. The doctor's office was a small, clean room that smelled of carbolic acid. The doctor, a weary man with kind eyes, took Ellen into his examination room, leaving Caleb to wait. He paced the small waiting area like a caged wolf, his hands clenched and unclenched at his sides. The helplessness was eating him alive. When Ellen emerged, a small white bandage stark against her dark hair. He stopped pacing. She looked shaken, but her eyes were clear. The doctor gave Caleb instructions for cleaning the wound and sent them on their way. As they sat on the small wooden bench outside the office, waiting for the doctor's boy to fetch their horses, the adrenaline faded, leaving them both trembling. Without a word, Caleb reached over and took her hand. He didn't just hold it, he threaded his fingers through hers, his thumb stroking the back of her hand in a slow, soothing rhythm. It was a simple, profound gesture of possession, of alliance. They sat there, their hands tightly clasped. For all the town to see, they were no longer a man and his hired hand. They were a man and his woman, facing the world together, a unit. And in that public declaration, the awkwardness that had plagued them since the storm finally dissolved, replaced by a quiet, fierce certainty. The ride home was transformed. The world, washed clean by the melted snow, seemed vibrant and new. The prairie grasses were a tender green, and the air was sweet and mild. Sunlight broke through the thinning clouds, turning the lingering patches of snow into fields of diamonds. They rode in silence, but it was a shared, sweet silence now. The silence of two people who had passed through a fire and found each other on the other side. Their clasped hands in town had said everything that needed to be said. As they approached the ranch, Caleb didn't lead the horses to the barn. Instead, he veered toward the gentle rise behind the cabin, where a single, massive oak tree stood sentinel. Its bare branches reached for the sky like a supplicant's arms. Ellen knew this place. It was where his wife was buried. A quiet panic fluttered in her chest. He dismounted and helped her down, his hands lingering at her waist. He led her to the base of the great tree, a few feet from the simple wooden cross that marked Martha's grave. He looked at the cross for a long moment, a silent communion, and then he turned to Ellen. "I need to show you something," he said. He went to his saddlebag and returned with a small spade. He began to dig at the base of the tree, the soft, damp earth yielding easily. A few inches down, he uncovered a small, oilskin-wrapped package. He brushed the dirt from it and carefully untied the cord. Inside was a leather-bound journal. "This was Martha's," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "After she died, I couldn't read it, but I couldn't destroy it either. So I buried it here. A part of her, a part of me." He held the journal for a moment, his knuckles white. He was a man holding his own grief, his own past, in his hands. Then he took a match from his pocket, struck it on his boot heel, and held the flame to the corner of the book. The dry pages caught quickly, curling and blackening, the words turning to ash. He didn't drop it. He held it as it burned, watching the tangible remnant of his past turn to smoke and float away on the gentle breeze. It wasn't an act of erasure or anger. It was an act of release. When it was almost consumed, he let the smoldering remains fall to the ground. He looked at Ellen, and his eyes, clear and deep, held a truth that shook her to her soul. "She is my past," he said, his voice steady and sure. He reached out and cupped her face, his thumb gently tracing the line of her jaw. "You, Ellen, you are the present." Tears welled in her eyes, tears of a joy so profound it was painful. This was it. This was the answer to the unspoken question. This was the declaration. He leaned in and kissed her, and this kiss was nothing like the desperate, frantic embrace in the storm-tossed stable. That had been an act of survival, a choice made in the dark. This was a choice made in the light. It was slow and deep and tender, a kiss of promise, of beginning, of a heart consciously, willingly, choosing to love again. They returned to the cabin as the sun was setting, painting the snow-dusted prairie in hues of rose and gold. That night, she did not go to her small room. She went to his. Their life began then, in the small, quiet moments that followed. The next day, He was on the roof, hammering down shingles loosened by the blizzard, his movements sure and steady, securing the home they now truly shared. Ellen, sitting by the fire, took out a pair of needles and a bundle of soft, gray wool. She began to knit him a sweater, the rhythmic click of the needles a quiet song of contentment, a weaving of her life into his. They were no longer two solitary figures against a harsh landscape. They were a family, building a fragile, beautiful future, one hammer blow, one stitch at a time. The peace they had fought so hard to win was as fragile as a skim of ice on morning water. It lasted for 3 beautiful, quiet weeks. They worked, they talked, they fell into the easy, unspoken rhythms of a husband and wife. The ranch, which had been a place of solitary labor for Caleb and a temporary refuge for Ellen, was finally becoming a home for them both. But the town had not forgotten them, and its malice, having been thwarted by fists and stone walls, now sought a new, more insidious weapon: the law. The blow came on a Tuesday, delivered by a grim-faced deputy from the town. He handed Caleb a folded document, sealed with the town council's official stamp. It was a formal summons. A petition had been filed by a committee of concerned citizens, led by none other than Preacher Gable, to have Caleb's land grant reviewed and potentially revoked. The official grounds were stated in cold, bureaucratic language: conduct unbecoming a member of this community, and the establishment of a household contrary to public morals. Caleb read the words, his face slowly hardening into a mask of cold fury. Ellen read them over his shoulder, and the color drained from her cheeks. The legalese was a thin veil for the true accusation, which was spelled out in the attached affidavits, a collection of vicious lies and twisted half-truths signed by the O'Driscolls, Mrs. Gable, and a dozen others. The document painted Ellen as a professional woman of ill repute, a fugitive from a dark, criminal past in a town called Redemption, who had seduced a grieving widower to gain control of his property. It was a masterpiece of righteous cruelty. That night, Ellen couldn't eat. The food tasted like ash in her mouth. She watched Caleb stare into the fire, the legal papers lying on the table between them like a coiled snake. She saw the tension in his shoulders, the hard set of his jaw, and she knew, with a certainty that felt like a physical sickness, that she was the cause of it all. She had brought this plague upon him. She had survived the fire of her old life only to set his new one ablaze. Before dawn the next morning, while Caleb was in the barn, she made her decision. It was the only one she could make. She packed her few belongings into the same small bundle she had arrived with. She wrote a short, tear-blotted note, leaving it on the pillow of the bed they now shared. Asterisk. Forgive me. I will not be the reason you lose everything. She was halfway to the main path, a ghost slipping away into the gray pre-dawn light. When he caught up to her, he didn't shout her name. He simply appeared before her, a tall, solid shadow blocking her escape, his horse's breath pluming in the frigid air. "Where do you think you're going?" he asked, his voice deceptively calm. "Away," she whispered, clutching her bundle to her chest. "Caleb, please, let me go. If I'm gone, they have no case. You can tell them you sent the harlot on her way. You can save your home." "My home?" he said, swinging down from his horse. He strode toward her, his face a thundercloud of emotions. "You think this is about land, about dirt and wood? You think I'd trade you for a piece of paper?" "It's your whole life," she cried, tears streaming down her face. "It's your father's legacy. I can't let you lose it because of me." He grabbed her by the shoulders, his grip firm but not harsh, forcing her to look at him. The wind whipped her hair across her face, and the rising sun cast a pale, weak light on their confrontation. "Then you still don't understand," he said, his voice dropping to a low, fierce growl. "This land was just a place to hide. My life was just a way to pass the time until I died. It didn't mean anything until you—" He let her go and threw his head back, his voice rising to a raw, powerful roar that seemed to challenge the wind itself, the town, the entire hostile world. I choose you, he bellowed, the words tearing from the very depths of his soul. Do you hear me? I choose you. Over the land, over the town, over everything. I choose you, even if hell opens its gates. He stood there, panting in the cold air, his declaration echoing across the silent prairie. It was not a plea, it was a vow. A defiant, irrevocable choice made against the world. Ellen stared at him, her tears forgotten, her heart hammering against her ribs. In his eyes, she saw no doubt, no fear, only a fierce, unwavering certainty that wrapped around her and held her fast. She had been running her whole life. For the first time, someone was telling her to stay, not for what she could do for them, but for who she was. She dropped her bundle in the snow and walked back to the house, his hand in hers. The hearing was held in the town hall, which also served as a church and a meeting room. The space was packed, the air thick with the smell of wet wool and simmering hostility. The entire town seemed to be there, their face a sea of grim, judgmental stares. Ellen and Caleb sat alone on a bench at the front, a pair of defendants before a hostile court. On the other side sat Preacher Gable, his wife, and their allies, their faces smug and confident. The town council president, a hardware merchant named Peterson, presided. He was a man who valued order above all else, and he clearly disliked this messy, emotional business. He called the meeting to order, and Preacher Gable was the first to speak. He spoke of the sanctity of their community, of moral decay, of the sacred duty to protect the flock from wolves in sheep's clothing. He was eloquent and persuasive, painting a picture of Caleb as a fallen man and Ellen as a predatory Jezebel. One of the O'Driscoll brothers then gave a fabricated, slurred testimony about seeing improper behavior at the ranch. Then, Peterson looked at Ellen. "Ma'am," he said, his voice not unkind, "these are serious accusations. Do you have anything to say in your defense?" All eyes turned to her. She could feel their collective weight, the crushing force of their conviction. Her hands trembled in her lap. Caleb reached over and squeezed her hand, a silent message of support. She looked at him, at his unwavering faith, and drew strength from it. She stood up, her back straight, her chin high. "My name is Ellen," she began, her voice shaking slightly at first, but growing stronger with every word. "It is true that my past is full of sadness. It is true that my husband, Silas, is dead, and that I left the town of Redemption under a cloud of suspicion." A murmur went through the crowd. Preacher Gable smiled faintly. "But what they did not tell you," Ellen continued, her voice ringing with a newfound clarity, "is the truth of that past. They call me a harlot. The truth is I was a wife who endured a husband with a heavy hand and a soul soured by drink. They call me a murderer. The truth is I am a widow." She paused, taking a deep, steadying breath. This was the hardest part, the secret she had buried deep, the shame she had carried alone. She looked directly at Mrs. Gable, whose face was a mask of pious revulsion. "The night my husband died," Ellen said, her voice dropping, forcing the room to lean in to hear. "He did not simply fall down the stairs in a drunken stupor. That is the story I told the sheriff, because I was ashamed, because I was afraid. The truth is he came home that night, full of whiskey and rage, and he tried to force himself upon me. He tried to take from me the one thing a wife is supposed to give freely." A wave of shock rippled through the room. The silence was absolute, broken only by a woman's sharp gasp. "I fought him," Ellen continued, her eyes now brimming with tears, but her voice unbroken. "I ran. He chased me to the stairs and he grabbed me, and in his drunken rage, he lost his footing and fell. I did not push him. I was running for my life." She stood there, her testimony complete, her most painful secret laid bare for this hostile crowd to see. She had stripped herself of her last defense, offering them only the raw, ugly truth. Into the stunned silence, a new voice spoke, an old man, A rancher Caleb knew only by sight struggled to his feet at the back of the room. His face was weathered, his hands gnarled by a lifetime of work. "We all know what kind of man Silas was," the old rancher said, his voice raspy but clear. "A no-good gambler who beat his horse and likely his wife, and we all know what happens when men get blind with drink and rage." He looked around the room, his gaze resting on the faces of his neighbors. "This woman has been through the fire. Her husband's abuse was a kind of death. The town of Redemption turning its back on her was another. We shouldn't be so eager to kill a person for a third time." His words hung in the air, a simple, powerful rebuke to the sanctimonious cruelty that had filled the room. Preacher Gable opened his mouth to object, but Council President Peterson held up a hand. He looked at Ellen, then at Caleb, then at the divided faces of the town. "This council finds no legal grounds to revoke Mr. Caleb's land grant," he declared, his voice firm. "The accusations brought forth are based on hearsay and prejudice. The petition is dismissed." A sigh of relief escaped Ellen's lips. "However," Peterson continued, his eyes stern, "this has been a deeply divisive incident. The moral character of this community is a serious matter. Your household, Mr. Caleb, will be under the continued scrutiny of this council. I advise you to conduct your affairs with the utmost discretion. This meeting is adjourned." It was a victory, but a qualified one. They were free, but they were on notice, as the room erupted into angry mutters and quiet conversations. Caleb stood and took Ellen's hand. They walked, heads held high, down the center aisle and out the double doors, leaving the judgment and the whispers behind them. Outside, the world was blindingly bright. The late afternoon sun had finally broken through the winter clouds, and its light reflecting off the snow was brilliant. They paused on the steps of the town hall, blinking in the sudden glare, and for the first time, in the full light of day, in front of the whole world, they looked at each other and smiled. It was not a smile of triumph, but of quiet, profound, and resilient joy. Hand in hand, they walked toward their horses, toward their ranch, toward their future. Winter's grip on the prairie did not loosen. It shattered. The thaw came with a rush, a great sigh of relief from the land itself. The deep snows melted into torrents, swelling the creek until it sang a loud, boisterous song. The earth, dark and rich, emerged from its white slumber, breathing a scent of damp soil and new beginnings. Almost overnight, the rolling brown hills were washed with a faint, tender green, and the first hardy wildflowers, purple verbena and yellow primrose, pushed their brave faces toward a sun that was finally learning to be warm again. The ranch, and the two souls who called it home, underwent a similar transformation. The harsh trial in town had not broken them. It had forged them. The victory, however qualified, had burned away the last of their doubts, leaving a core of pure, unshakable certainty. They were no longer just a man and a woman surviving together. They were a unit, a partnership, their lives intertwined like the roots of the ancient oak on the hill. The change was visible in the rhythm of their days. The shared silence was now one of complete, easy companionship. Laughter, a sound that had been a stranger to the cabin, became a frequent guest, often over a small, shared joke or a clumsy mishap. They worked with a renewed sense of purpose, not just to endure, but to build. Ellen claimed a patch of sun-drenched earth near the cabin and, with Caleb's help, tilled it and fenced it off from hungry deer. She planted rows of beans, squash, and corn, her hands moving with a loving familiarity through the soil. The garden became her domain, a place of quiet, hopeful creation that mirrored the new life blooming within her own heart. Caleb, in turn, threw himself back into the work he had abandoned in his grief. He had once been a respected horse breeder, known for his fine, sturdy stock. He'd sold off most of his best animals after Martha's death, keeping only what he needed to work the ranch. Now, he rode out and bought 2 fine new mares, their coats gleaming in the spring sun. He reopened the far pastures, his energy boundless, his eyes alight with a passion Ellen had never seen before. He was not just tending to his grief anymore. He was investing in the future, their future. As the corn grew knee-high and the days grew long and warm, they decided to mark the turning of the season and their lives. "We should have a party," Ellen had suggested one evening, a tentative trial balloon. "A harvest supper to celebrate the new foals in the garden." Caleb had looked at her, a slow smile spreading across his face. "A party," he repeated, testing the word. It felt foreign, but right. "All right, let's have a party." It was a bold act, a quiet declaration to the world that they were not ashamed, not hiding. They invited their few neighbors, sending word with Jedediah. They didn't know who, if anyone, would come. The evening of the supper. The air was warm and fragrant with the scent of blooming peach blossoms from the single tree by the cabin. Ellen had cooked for 2 days, filling the table with roast chicken, fresh-baked bread, and vegetables from her garden. Lanterns were hung from the porch beams, casting a warm, golden glow as twilight settled. Jedediah was the first to arrive, bringing a jug of his homemade cider and a wide, gap-toothed grin. Then came the old rancher who had spoken for them at the hearing, with his quiet, smiling wife. A few other families from the outlying ranches followed, people who lived by the code of the land rather than the gossip of the town. They were a small group, perhaps 15 souls in all, but their presence filled the small ranch with a warmth that had nothing to do with the summer air. Preacher Gable and his flock, of course, were conspicuously absent. The town remained a distant, disapproving island. The party was a simple, gentle affair. The men talked of cattle prices and the lack of rain, while the women admired Ellen's garden and praised her cooking. For the first time, Ellen felt the tentative threads of community being woven around her. These people looked at her not as a sinner or a homewrecker, but as Caleb's woman, a fellow survivor in this beautiful, unforgiving land. At one point, as the stars began to burn brightly in the indigo sky, Caleb drew Ellen away from the low hum of conversation. He led her to the edge of the lantern light, where the darkness of the prairie met the small circle of their celebration. He looked at the small gathering, then back at her, his face serious in the flickering light. "It's not the whole world," he said, his voice a low rumble, "but it's a start." "It's more than enough," she whispered, her heart full. He reached out, his calloused thumb gently stroking her cheek. "We don't need the whole world, Ellen," he said, his gaze holding hers, his eyes reflecting the deep, endless night sky. "We just need each other." His words were the purest truth she had ever known. They were their own world, their own nation of two. Everything else was just scenery. Later, after the last wagon had rattled away down the path, leaving behind the pleasant ghosts of laughter and conversation, a deep, peaceful quiet settled over the ranch. The air was cool now, and the moon had risen, a perfect silver disk that bathed the world in a soft, ethereal light. Caleb did not move to go inside. Instead, he took Ellen's hand and led her to the small patch of grass beside the blooming peach tree. The white blossoms seemed to glow in the moonlight, releasing their sweet perfume into the night. "I believe," he said, a rare, shy smile touching his lips, "that a party should end with a dance." He pulled her into his arms, one hand on the small of her back, the other holding her hand. There was no music, save for the chirping of crickets and the distant, lonely call of a coyote. But it was all they needed. They began to move, a slow, swaying circle under the stars. He was not a graceful dancer, but he was a strong and steady one. Ellen laid her head against his chest, closing her eyes, feeling the solid, rhythmic beat of his heart beneath her ear. This was safety. This was home. She had arrived at this gate a beggar, filthy and starving, willing to do anything for a place to sleep. She had offered her labor in exchange for survival. Now, wrapped in the arms of this good, quiet man, surrounded by the life they were building. She felt a wave of emotion so profound it almost buckled her knees. She tilted her head back, looking up at his strong, bearded face, illuminated by the moonlight. "Caleb?" she whispered, her voice thick. "What is it?" he asked, his voice gentle. "I'm not asking for work anymore," she said, her words a quiet, fervent vow. "I am yours." He stopped dancing. He looked down at her, and his expression was one of such deep, aching tenderness that it made her heart swell. He lowered his head and kissed her, a kiss that was full of all the unspoken words, all the shared hardships, all the quiet joys of the past months. It was a kiss of belonging. He lifted her into his arms as easily as if she were a child and carried her into the cabin, into their room. The moonlight streamed through the window, painting silver patterns on the floorboards and the simple quilt of their bed. He undressed her slowly, reverently, his hands worshiping the body that had endured so much. She, in turn, unbuttoned his shirt, her fingers tracing the strong, warm lines of his chest. This was not the desperate, frantic coupling of the storm. There was no fear here, no howling chaos to cling against. There was only a deep, abiding peace. This was a union born of trust, of love, of unwavering commitment. Their movements were slow, gentle, a languid exploration of a landscape they were only just beginning to truly know. It was a quiet consecration, a merging of two solitudes into a single, shared soul. His strength enveloped her, and her softness gentled him. The moonlight and the shadows played across their skin, two halves of a whole, finding their completion in the dark, in the quiet of the room, surrounded by the vast, sleeping prairie. They came together not just as bodies seeking release, but as two hearts finally, irrevocably, claiming their home in each other. A year passed, measured not in the turning of a calendar's pages, but in the slow, certain cycles of the prairie. Summer bled into a golden autumn, which gave way to a winter of quiet, snow-blanketed peace, which in turn surrendered to the riotous green promise of another spring. The ranch thrived. The herd of horses grew, their foals gamboling in the pastures, and Ellen's garden became a lush, productive Eden that fed them through the seasons. The most profound change, however, was taking place within Ellen herself. By early summer, it was undeniable. She was carrying their child. The discovery was not a dramatic revelation, but a quiet, shared moment of awe one morning when she took Caleb's hand and placed it on her gently swelling abdomen. He froze, his rough, calloused hand spread wide, and a look of such profound, wondering joy crossed his face that it brought tears to her eyes. From that day on, a new energy infused Caleb. The man who had once been content with a simple, Spartan cabin now saw it through the eyes of a father. He became a whirlwind of purposeful construction. He added a new room to the back of the cabin, a nursery, with a large window to let in the morning light. He spent his evenings carving a cradle from a beautiful piece of pale cottonwood, the scrape of his knife a soothing, rhythmic sound in the quiet of the house. He was not just building a room. He was building a nest, a fortress of love and safety for the new life that was coming. The town, too, had slowly, almost grudgingly, begun to change. Time, and the unwavering dignity with which Caleb and Ellen conducted themselves, had proven to be a powerful solvent for prejudice. Their story had become less a scandalous rumor and more a local legend. The doctor's wife stopped Ellen in the mercantile one day, not to whisper or stare, but to press a small, hand-knitted baby blanket into her hands. Jedediah became a fixture, stopping by weekly with unsolicited advice and small gifts. Even some of the O'Driscoll brothers, when passing Caleb on the trail, would offer a curt, respectful nod. They were no longer outcasts. They were simply neighbors, a family. The true test of that acceptance came at the height of the dry season. In late August, a lightning strike, miles to the west, birthed a monster, a prairie fire. It started as a smudge of smoke on the horizon, but driven by a hot, relentless wind, It grew into a roaring, unstoppable wall of flame that devoured the dry grass, advancing on their ranch with terrifying speed. Jedediah was the first to see it, riding his horse to a lather to bring the warning. "It's coming fast, Caleb, and it's wide!" There was no time for fear. There was only time for action. Caleb's mind, honed by a lifetime on the plains, became sharp and clear. "Ellen, get the well. Soak every blanket, every rug we have. Douse the walls of the cabin and the barn. Jedediah, ride for help!" As Jedediah galloped away, Caleb began the desperate work of creating a firebreak, plowing a wide, bare strip of earth around the homestead, a desperate gamble to starve the beast of its fuel. Ellen worked with a calm, focused intensity, her movements slowed by her pregnancy but no less determined. She pumped water until her arms ached, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. The fire was upon them before the firebreak was complete. It came with a sound like a freight train, a deep, deafening roar. The sky turned a sickly, apocalyptic orange, and the air grew thick with choking smoke and shimmering heat. The horses, trapped in the main corral, screamed with terror, their eyes wide and white. "I have to get them out," Caleb yelled over the roar, his face black with soot. "They'll be burned alive." "It's too late!" Ellen screamed back, her voice raw with terror. "Caleb, no!" But he was already gone, pulling his bandana over his face and running toward the corral, a silhouette against a wall of flame. He fought with the gate, the wood hot to the touch, and plunged into the swirling chaos of panicked animals. He emerged moments later, driving the terrified herd before him, slapping their rumps to send them galloping toward the relative safety of the plowed fields to the east. And then the wind shifted. A great fiery gust swept a tongue of flame over the corral fence, cutting off his path of retreat. He was trapped. Ellen watched in horror as the flames closed in, a ring of fire surrounding the man she loved. Just as despair threatened to swallow her whole, she heard it, the thunder of hoofbeats and the shouting of men. Over the ridge came a dozen riders. Jedediah, the old rancher from the hearing, the doctor, and to her utter astonishment, 2 of the O'Driscoll brothers among them. The town had come. They didn't hesitate. They rode straight into the fray, their faces set with grim determination, carrying wet sacks and shovels, while half the men began widening the firebreak, battling the encroaching flames. The other half, led by Ellen, formed a bucket brigade from the well, their movements a frantic, desperate dance against the inferno. Ellen, her dress soaked, her face streaked with ash, pointed and shouted, her voice hoarse but clear, directing their efforts with an authority born of pure desperation. She was no longer a victim. She was a general in a war for their home. The O'Driscolls, seeing Caleb's plight, charged their horses through a low spot in the flames, their own fear forgotten in the face of a neighbor's peril. They reached him, pulling him up onto a horse just as the corral fence collapsed into a shower of sparks and embers. For hours they fought, a small army of neighbors against an elemental force of destruction. They battled side by side, their past grievances and suspicions burned away by the consuming heat, until finally, as the wind died down and the sun began to set, the fire passed them by, leaving a blackened, smoldering scar upon the land. The homestead, an oasis of damp, scorched wood and trampled mud, was saved. Exhausted, filthy, and sore, the neighbors began to depart, their faces weary but filled with a shared quiet pride. They offered handshakes and clasped shoulders, their gestures speaking more than words ever could. They had faced the monster together, and they had won. Caleb, his arms singed and his clothes in tatters, found Ellen sitting on the porch steps, her hands resting on her belly, her body trembling with delayed shock. He sat down beside her in the smoky twilight, the smell of burnt grass thick in the air. For a long time, they said nothing, simply watching the last of the embers glow like angry red eyes in the blackened field. He finally turned to her, his voice raspy and full of an emotion she couldn't quite name. "You came here," he began, his voice low. "A beggar, asking for work, just a place to sleep." He reached out and gently brushed a smudge of soot from her cheek. "Tonight, you stood your ground. You led those men. You saved this place. You saved me. He looked around at their scorched but standing home. "You didn't just save the ranch. Ellen, you saved everything that matters." She leaned her head on his shoulder, her body finally relaxing into his. The terror of the day receded, leaving behind a deep, bone-weary gratitude. They had been tested by fire, and their love, and their community, had held. 2 months later, in the new room with the morning sun streaming in, their child was born. It was a girl, with a fuzz of dark hair and her mother's determined chin. "What will we name her?" Caleb whispered, looking down at the tiny, perfect infant cradled in Ellen's arms. Ellen looked from her daughter's face to her husband's, her heart so full it felt like it might burst. She thought of their journey, the darkness and the fear, the struggle and the prejudice, and the incredible, resilient love that had bloomed in the most unlikely of places. There was only one name that felt right. "Hope," she said softly. "Her name is Hope." The story ends, as so many do, with a sunset, but for this family, it was also a sunrise. A few weeks later, Caleb, Ellen, and baby Hope, wrapped snugly against her mother's chest, walked out onto the prairie. The land was already healing, new green shoots pushing up through the blackened earth. They stood on the rise by the great oak tree, the three of them, and watched as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the vast sky in brilliant strokes of orange and pink and purple. It was the end of a day, and the end of a long, dark night. Before them, bathed in the soft golden light of dusk, lay their home, their future, and their boundless, hard-won hope. Thank you so much for listening to our story tonight around the campfire. We'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from, so please leave a comment below and say hello. Be sure to subscribe to Wild West Campfire for more tales from the frontier, and feel free to share your thoughts on Caleb and Ellen's journey.